Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific program. And today we're going to talk about something very interesting, India-Bangladesh ties. I have with me a very special guest, Rushali. Rushali is an independent researcher and a threat intelligence analyst who has worked extensively on South Asia and the Indo-Pacific. She was a former visiting fellow to the Stimson Center and also writes regularly for The Diplomat. Rushali, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Vanshika, for having me. I'm very excited to be a part of this podcast today.
Thank you, Rushali. So this is very, very timely. Today, we're going to discuss India's recent engagement with Bangladesh and the current state of affairs after more than 6 months of the change in government. So our listeners, I'm hoping, have a fair idea of what's happening. But just to give an overview, so under Sheikh Hasina's leadership, we know India and Bangladesh enjoyed a relatively stable and cooperative relationship. There were agreements on trade, energy, regional connectivity. But after the transition to the interim government last year, this trajectory was disrupted. And India's over-reliance on the friendly Awami League exposed structural vulnerabilities in its foreign policy. Rushali, we're seeing this cyclical nature in their relationship, right? So what do you think makes this phase of the cycle different, if at all?
Right. Thank you so much, Vanshika. And I do think you provided a fairly exhaustive overview of what's been happening over the past few months. As you again correctly pointed out, the nature of this relationship has always been quite cyclical. But I think first things first is that we have to really resist the temptation to make any overarching assumptions about ties based on what is happening right now. As you correctly pointed out, it's just been 6 months, right? And we're talking about a bilateral relationship which spans over 50 years, right? So what is clear, of course, is that relations are in a downward spiral, right? So most things are on hold. So we've seen that I think the passenger train services, which was suspended back in August, remain suspended. The future of projects, like both existing projects, like the ongoing ones, as well as future projects, it remains very uncertain, right? And the fact is that most of this uncertainty actually, I think, stems from the very uncertainty over Bangladesh's political future. So coming back to the question of the cyclical nature, yes, we've seen that when Awami League is in power, India's enjoyed very stable, healthy relations. But under the BNP and under the military rule, ties did not progress quite substantively. But even during this time, right, under the BNP or under the military, there was some modicum of political stability. So the lines of communications were maintained. But what we're now seeing is that while communication is, of course, ongoing, but the very lack of Bangladesh's own political stability is, I think, the biggest challenge. And that is where the nature of the relationships it has a huge impact on that, right? And we also have to remember that Hasina has been in power since 2008, right? So since 2008, India has dealt with a fairly stable Bangladesh in terms of bilateral relations. Of course, I'm not talking about what was happening domestically in Bangladesh, but at the bilateral level, as far as India-Bangladesh ties were concerned, there was stability. It was overall on a positive trajectory, right? So now that stability is lost, right? India is having to deal with a very new political landscape. So that, I think, is a very distinctive feature in this bilateral relationship, which New Delhi hasn't had to deal with for a very long time. I think that is where the change in this cyclical bilateral relation comes in.
Right, right. And I think just 2 days before we saw Yunus, give a public statement, he said Bangladesh India relations cannot be bad. We're close. We're highly interdependent. There have been some conflicts, but they're largely due to propaganda, and we're trying to overcome these misunderstandings. And he also said there is no problem in our basic relationship with India. So I think there is some understanding on their end as well. But there have been issues, for example, the attacks against Hindus, which India has been bringing up. But also, interestingly, and this leads me to the second question around the extradition of Sheikh Hasina, right? So, how do you assess India's reluctance to extradite her, and do you think this could become a sort of long-term diplomatic flashpoint?
Yes, indeed. So this is something actually which is quite interesting, and I've been following sort of Bangladesh media coverage on this issue, sort of like the editorials which are coming out, as well as official statements. And it's obviously very clear that Bangladesh has, of course, formally already requested India to extradite Hasina. And even during the two high-level meetings, actually, which took place with Misri and Jaishankar, with Bangladesh's foreign affairs advisor, the issue of extradition from the Bangladesh side has been really clear, and they are insistent on this demand. What is interesting is that while the Ministry of External Affairs has acknowledged receiving this extradition request, it has really not commented much on the issue. Now, whether India will extradite or not, honestly, I think requires a podcast in itself. But my assessment is that that is unlikely. Okay. As the issue currently stands, it's unlikely. There are a lot of legal issues involved as well. And there are actually options for India to sort of, if not deny outright, but withhold and delay the extradition on this thing. Now, for Bangladesh, how I see it is it's a bigger challenge for them to get this done, right? Because it is, of course, heavily politicized, but it is also linked to the interim government's legitimacy, right? So this is also sort of brings in the anti-India sentiment, right? So for New Delhi, what the thing is that if the extradition does not follow through, and the messaging has to be such that it does not sort of provoke more anti-India sentiments, right? Because at this point the very association between Hasina and India, right, is something which is really, really creating a lot of fury within the people at the very domestic public opinion level. Having said that, I do think there is scope, there is hope for this issue to be resolved through backchannel diplomacy, through talks. So I don't think it is going to escalate to some sort of a diplomatic flashpoint, but a lot of it will also depend on how sort of the other variables in this relationship develop. But as it currently stands, what I can tell you is that from Bangladesh, the request to extradite Hasina from India is the primary issue that they are pressing on. And it'll be interesting to see actually how India deals with it. So right now, I think it's a challenge, so to speak, but not something that will potentially derail relations.
Right, right. I think that's important. So before I bring in some of the other important regional players into this conversation, in a recent article, you argue that India should pursue quiet diplomacy with Bangladesh over the more loud sort of megaphone diplomacy. So can you give examples of what this approach is and how it has perhaps worked in the past?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for reading that article. Yes, in fact, I do talk about how I see quiet diplomacy as the way forward to sort of navigate the new realities in India Bangladesh ties. And to answer your questions in terms of examples, so to speak, I think the most recent and the prominent example of successful quiet diplomacy being conducted by New Delhi would be what happened in Qatar, right? So we saw that Delhi was able to secure the release of 8 Indian nationals who were given the death sentence in Qatar, right?
Mm.
And in fact, to an extent where both countries recently elevated their relationship to a strategic partnership. So it was very clear that they've overcome that issues. Now, while I do have my own thoughts about the elevation of ties, which is something I've written about as well, but overall, the optics of it indicates, right, that ties are perfect, ties are back to what they were, if not more improved, which works really well for both sides. So this, I think, was an example where quiet back-channel diplomacy worked really well, and both sides were able to sort of reconcile their differences and take relations to a higher, different level. Okay. On the other hand, if we look at like the megaphone diplomacy, right? Look at India-Canada ties, right? Look what happened there when Trudeau sort of tried to discuss contentious bilateral issues through the media. I think you and our listeners would also agree that that wasn't a very good case or a high point for Canadian diplomacy, right? So that's sort of what I'm talking about. So even Yunus sort of using the media to communicate with India to convey his discontent over Hasina and sort of asking India to repeatedly send Hasina back to India or keep her quiet. I think it was in an interview with BBC where he said that until we are bringing her back, it's India's responsibility to make sure she's quiet. So things like that, I think, is sort of overall detrimental to their relations, right? And I think, like, during my research for the piece, I came across this very interesting description of megaphone diplomacy, which was something along the lines of walking loudly and carrying a small stick. So that's what's happening, right? So I think Yunus has come ahead and himself said that we need India, we need good relations with India. So when you're acknowledging the need for it, resorting to this sort of megaphone diplomacy, which I think may get you some short-term political benefit with like in terms of sort of riding on the anti-India wave, overall it is very detrimental to ties, and India-Bangladesh relations are very crucial for a stable neighborhood. It is crucial for Bangladesh more so, particularly now given the domestic political economic turmoil it is facing. So yes, that is something that I think I was talking about in the article, and I think quiet diplomacy would be more helpful in bringing relations back on track.
Right, right. That's very interesting. Talking about stable neighborhood, since you gave me the perfect phrase to jump the next question off on, how do you see the new government shaping its foreign policy, especially towards Pakistan and China? So we're seeing this increasing rapprochement between Pakistan and Bangladesh, also between China. What is happening and what does this mean for India?
Right. Okay. So, very honestly, at the outset, I think Yunus is too preoccupied with domestic issues, specifically sort of building a political legitimacy, reviving the conditions of Pakistan, to focus so much on foreign policy, right? Having said that, as you, of course, very correctly pointed out, there have been quite a few significant developments on the foreign policy front, particularly the revival of Bangladesh and Pakistan ties, right? So I think Sharif and Yunus have already met twice, if I'm not wrong, and they've decided to sort of ease visa regulations. They've established direct flights. I think Bangladesh is talking to Pakistan about acquiring its JF-17 Thunder jets. There's been a start of direct government-to-government trade. So a lot is happening there, right? And these are all important developments, undoubtedly. But I don't think that Pakistan has come to a place where it can replace India. And I don't think Bangladesh is even trying to do so. Simply put, I think this is a partnership which is being driven by necessity. It is opportunistic in many ways for both sides. But overall, whether it's a complete rehaul of relations, I honestly have my reservations because there's a lot of historical baggage there, right? And I have questions about the long term viability of this relationship. I don't see it as very sustainable. And interestingly, you brought in China. So I think China's role as a partner to both Bangladesh and Pakistan does add a very interesting layer of complexity. But again, I think that for it to become like a trilateral axis, like a China, Bangladesh, Pakistan axis versus India, there's a long, long way ahead for that, right? And that is something which could, of course, potentially alter South Asia's geostrategic landscape. But again, the question is, will it become that? I think it's also worth asking, like, unless Bangladesh becomes economically stable, will China even sustain its interest here? Because we've seen, okay, in many ways, Pakistan has become somewhat of a baggage for China. And the increasing attack on Chinese workers in Bangladesh is something which is clearly of concern in Beijing, right? And they're realizing that there's a lot of, it's not an equal, of course, relationship, but China really has to invest a lot of energy, resources, money, diplomatic power in order to make this relationship really work. So for it to become an axis, like that would mean that China would have to sort of, carry the burden of both Bangladesh and Pakistan. I think an important question to ask, therefore, at this juncture would be, is even China willing to do that? Now, of course, that's something that only time will tell. But as I currently see it, until we have a stable government in Bangladesh, it's too early to sort of speak about long-term South Asian geopolitical realignment. There's a lot happening around the world. There's a lot happening in the extended Indo-Pacific neighborhood, right? So a lot of factors are in play right now. So specifically, if I look at Bangladesh, Pakistan rapprochement, or even Bangladesh, China sort of cozying up again, I really don't think it will make a very significant realignment of sorts. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So, for example, it's interesting, right? During Hasina's 15-year tenure, ties with Pakistan were, more or less strained. But
Right.
last week, we see Bangladesh has given Pakistan access to the Mongla port as well. And we saw a 22-member Bangladeshi delegation visit China last week. Last month, also, Beijing hosted a BNP delegation. So we are seeing sort of these diplomatic overtures made by both Bangladesh, both by China and Pakistan. So, but as you correctly pointed out, that the sustainability of this is something that we're yet to see. So, still continuing this discussion around the neighborhood, there's something else very interesting that happened, right? At the Indian Ocean Conference, there was a discussion on SARC, but India rejected Bangladesh's proposal to revive SARC and instead took a jab at Pakistan. So, do you think SARC has any future at all, or do you think BeamStack is now the more viable regional framework?
Right. So, how I read it, I wouldn't call it a rejection, I think, but it was more of a dismissal, right? And again, I really don't think that has a lot to do with sort of India-Bangladesh ties and where that is headed, because it's been very clear from India's side that SARC is really like, it's in many ways dead, right? So the last summit was held in 2014. And I think in 2016, there was supposed to be a summit in Pakistan, but that got stalled due to Pulwama attacks. I think after India, Nepal, Afghanistan, they all opted out. And so there's really been no developments on that front. And like, interestingly enough, I do remember during COVID, India had proposed a emergency fund and had even made some contributions to it. By some, I mean quite significant. I think 10 million, if I'm not wrong. So, but interestingly, there's no record on what happened to that fund from the secretariat, right? So what has happened to the SARC projects? There's literally like sort of no, forget positive or negative, there's been no developments at all, right? So for all practical purposes, it is really defunct, right? And India has also made it very clear that it prefers to deal with neighboring countries on a bilateral basis on many of the issues which these, so to say, smaller countries, right? And again, smaller in air quotes, of course, but these countries which are trying to bring up in this SARC forum. So yeah, SARC is defunct, and that has nothing to do with sort of contemporary development, so to speak. It's been happening for a very, very long time. And BIMSTEC definitely is the preferred forum for this. And again, if I'm not very mistaken, I think even the BJP's electoral manifesto, which was either for the recent elections or the previous one, it does even mention there specifically that BIMSTEC would be a forum to bring sort of take regional cooperation ahead. And that's for obvious reasons. I mean, firstly, Pakistan's sort of absence in the forum makes discussions much easier, right? And also the very fact that India was very involved in the setting up of BIMSTEC, right, dating back to 1997, which was not the case with SARC. I think like there was some reluctance and hesitation even when India was joining SARC on Bangladesh's initiative. And the very fact that BIMSTEC even focuses on sort of economic and technical cooperation, these are areas where India uses multilateral forums to sort of advance its diplomacy. And additionally, of course, we cannot ignore the presence of like the two Southeast Asian nations here, especially Thailand's presence, right? So, sort of Thailand, again, so to speak, is a big power alongside India. It sort of alleviates the fears of these smaller countries about dominance of one big power and this multilateral forum being captured by one forum. So, those fears to a large extent are addressed. So, yes, I think my overall assessment of the situation would be that SARC is dead, but sub regional diplomacy is something that India is definitely exploring. And BIMSTEC definitely would be very, is the preferred forum. And in fact, the article which you spoke about earlier, I do mention that a potential meeting between Yunus and Modi is expected at the BIMSTEC summit in April, and I think that would be a really good forum and a good place for both sides to talk about sort of reviving ties, and even for Delhi to use that forum to sort of maybe offer Bangladesh help. It was actually quite good to see that even in the 2025 budget, which recently came out, India did not reduce foreign aid for Bangladesh. Of course, it did increase it as it did with many other countries, but the very fact that it didn't reduce it is, I think, a positive step as far as bilateral ties are concerned. And using BIMSTEC as a forum to advance sort of like, economic cooperation and even offer aid would be actually a quite interesting development.
Right. So talking about economic cooperation, there have been suggestions, right, that India could use its economic incentives to bring Dhaka sort of back into its fold. So do you think this trade and investment cooperation will be enough to counter the political frictions?
Right. So, I mean, this is something actually I think I and many other analysts have been advocating for a very long time, is that the main challenge which India is sort of facing with regard to policy towards Bangladesh is that it's failed to create a sort of bipartisan consensus, right? And it's relied heavily on a certain political dispensation to advance its interest, to advance bilateral ties, which is a problem in itself. If we had deeper economic connectivity, I think that would translate to this bipartisan consensus over probably a much longer time period, but there is scope for that happening, right? So what we've witnessed is that since these sort of like the political upheaval in Bangladesh, there has been a huge decline in trade, right? Of course, that has to do with Bangladesh's own economic crisis, but bilateral trade has really reduced. And what I've also noticed that it is the traders in Calcutta, where I'm actually from, they are suffering, right? They are the ones who are really suffering. Transport passenger trade has sort of not resumed. The trains have not resumed. Visas remain suspended from the Indian side. Medical tourism has really been affected. Okay, so I think these are the steps where they do. I don't know if that translates exactly to your trade and investment question, but I think this is actually the way forward, and this is something that will help both sides to get back on track. Whether it can survive the political frictions or not, again, like I said, a lot depends on what happens when Bangladesh conducts elections, if it conducts elections, that is, which is, I think, scheduled for later in the year or early 2026. Still, the timeline is very unclear. So that's very like up in the air right now. But these smaller steps, so to speak, would be a good step forward, and definitely trade and economic ties and connectivity ties is something which would help ties, especially given our geography, right? There's so much scope for connectivity projects here. So if those are implemented, I think that'll have an overall positive relation on bilateral ties.
Right. No, you're absolutely correct. So, when we talk about trade, we sort of think of it on a very macroeconomic level. But as you said, there are, local traders across the border, across, like you said, Calcutta and across Dhaka, who are actually the ones, facing, suffering from sort of these political disruptions. And like you mentioned, medical tourism, people to people ties ultimately builds that layer of foundation and trust upon which, we can move forward with stronger and deeper political ties. So I get that. So just sort of, closing in on, the whole sort of relationship, how do you see their ties evolving in the next few years? As you pointed out, we need a sort of, a bipartisan connection. So do you see a hope for a reset, or, are we looking at a sort of longer term diplomatic cooling?
Right. So I think we don't need a reset in ties, so to speak, but what we need is a revival. Okay. Now, again, having said that, let me clarify that there was a lot wrong in bilateral ties as it stood from Dhaka's perspective, from Delhi's perspective as well. And there needs to be some changes in the overall direction of ties, as I said, like because we're dealing with a completely new reality, both external and both internal, right? So I think what we'll see from Bangladesh is where they will try to shift away from their, this perceived over reliance on a single partner and their lack of strategic autonomy. However, very practically speaking, the long term structural constraints that it faces, I think, will definitely, if not hamper, but definitely be an impediment if it's trying to implement some sort of like a completely change in bilateral relations and a change in the relationship, in the trajectory of the relationship, right? So that's why I think a reset is not very likely, but a revival of ties in a way which is, of course, mutually beneficial, in a way which is respectful in many ways, is something that is needed. What I also think is that this is really an opportunity for New Delhi also to sort of revisit some of the fundamentals of its neighborhood diplomacy and really understand the importance of, I've kept saying this throughout the podcast, but bipartisan consensus. That is something which really India should work towards. And it does not apply to just Bangladesh, but, the neighborhood at large. And so, yeah, I see this actually as an opportunity for New Delhi to sort of go back, look at it, and revise and rethink its diplomacy in that way. And overall ties, Bangladesh, India, I don't think it will reach a stage of ever sort of like a perpetual rivalry, so to speak. I don't think we'll get there. But we will not return to status quo as it was. We will deal with a new sort of dynamics, but one that is built on the foundations which are already in place. And to build that again, sort of to revive ties, I think that will be achieved through, I think, what you described as long term diplomatic cooling. So, yeah.
Right, right. So just to end on something interesting, I'm going to ask you a few rapid fire questions.
Yeah.
So hopefully this is going to be interesting for our listeners. So the first, if you had to describe India's current approach to Bangladesh, one word to do that.
Can I use two, please?
Yes, sure.
I think right now India is in like this wait and watch approach. So it's just sort of waiting and watching how the developments are panning out.
Okay. Okay. Second question. The most underrated factor in India Bangladesh ties.
Oh, it's definitely something that you alluded to people ties. That is something that is really underrated.
Okay. Which regional leader, Modi, Xi, or Pakistan's prime minister, has the most influence on Dhaka's foreign policy right now?
I mean, I'm fundamentally, I think, opposed to this idea because that's where the discontent comes from. So I think Yunus is the leader who will definitely have the most impact right now. But again, very realistically, and to give a spicier answer, honestly, simply owing to geography. Again, it's if not a specific leader, but simply because of geography, it's going to be India.
Lastly, since you mentioned India, if you could give one piece of advice to Indian policymakers regarding Bangladesh, what would it be?
Again, it's something I've kept saying throughout the podcast: build bipartisan support and take the domestic public opinion more seriously. So, more sort of multifaceted diplomacy, more on ground diplomacy. Yeah.
Right. And as you mentioned, India must also invest in sort of perception management because there is this sort of growing anti India sentiment in Bangladesh, which I think leaders on both end are trying to fix. So thank you, Rushali, for being on this podcast today. It was a lot of fun and hope to have you soon again.
Thank you, Vanshika. I had a great time. Looking forward to it again.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.